Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted today to be hosting the last session in our masterclass series. We're delighted to have Julie Scharper from the Baltimore Banner here. And the masterclass series highlights the important and award-winning work that MDDC journalists have done in 2023. So we're spotlighting our Best of Show winners from that contest. And Julie won Best of Show for Feature Story Non-Profile. So today we'll sort of dig behind the scenes and see how she puts her stories together and what she's doing. We'll put the link to her story, which is Justice for Gavin Knupp, who was a hit and run victim in Ocean City in 2023. So first, Julie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
So tell us a little bit first, you work at the Baltimore Banner, and so that's like a really interesting startup culture, and it feels like you have a really wide portfolio range for your beat, so spanning investigations, and not necessarily beat reporting, but it feels like you've got a lot of autonomy in what you cover. So can you tell us a little bit about what your beat is and a little bit about the Banner?
Sure. Yeah. I have been a journalist since 2005. I started at the Baltimore Sun and was there for a long time. I covered criminal justice. I covered City Hall for several years. I was a features reporter. And then I spent several years freelancing. I have 3 small children, so I left the Sun right before I had my second, and spent a number of years freelancing, but really missed the culture of daily journalism, really wanted to get back into that world. And so the Banner appeared at just the right moment for me, where I was really like, okay, everyone's going off to school. I, really want to get back into this world. The Banner is just an amazing startup. It is founded by, it was funded and founded by Stuart Bainum. Kimi Yoshino, who is just an amazing editor, came from the LA Times to be editor-in-chief. And it has a really unique culture in journalism because we're kind of trying to find our way. It is a nonprofit news site. So at the Sun, we were always sort of dealing with a lot of financial decisions being made from afar to benefit shareholders. And because the Banner is nonprofit, that we are able to plow the money we make back into the Banner. Our goal is to be financially sustainable in about 5 years after we launched. It's still work in progress, and we're always kind of trying things and calibrating. But we recently celebrated our 2nd anniversary. Our subscriber base is really growing. We're on track for revenue, and we just keep hiring new folks. So it's really neat to be there. And I was fortunate to be hired as an enterprise reporter. A lot of times when you say to people outside of journalism that you're an enterprise reporter, they think that you're a business reporter.
Right.
Or they make Star Trek jokes. But basically an enterprise reporter finds their own stories. So you don't necessarily have a defined beat. There's certain areas that I'm particularly interested in, and I think there's certain things that are kind of like, oh, that sort of sounds like a Julie story, that, the stories that I gravitate to. but I don't generally feel like, okay, well, I have to keep an eye on a certain institution or I have to keep an eye on a certain geographic area. So I have a lot of latitude to find my own stories, which is something that I've just always loved doing as a reporter. And one of my favorite parts of reporting is that we get to do something different every day. And I think as an enterprise reporter, that's especially true because you often parachute into a certain world, become completely enmeshed and engaged in that world for a while, and then eventually parachute out and move on to another story.
I think that is one of the most interesting things about being a reporter is like you have to dive in, become an expert on something in a really, uh, circumscribed period of time, and then teach it to someone else,
Mhm.
and then go and do it the next day or
Right.
or the next week. So in sort of thinking about that focus, and of course, Who Killed Gavin Knupp is the title of the piece that you won for. But as an enterprise reporter, sort of what drew you to, what do you normally like to gravitate? What's a Julie story? And then what about this situation drew your attention? Because, honestly, the Banner, although it stretches, it's not in Ocean City. So this is a little
Yeah.
bit farther out. So tell us more, like, what's the Julie story and what drew you to this one?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, uh, I'm drawn to fun features often. I've written everything from silly stories about how bad the wild ponies at Assateague can be to a old coffin, an 1800s coffin that washed up on the in Wyman Park a couple summers ago.
That was a fun one. Actually, the guy who was doing some landscaping for me at that time found that coffin, and he was like, "Oh, it was so cool that the reporter came
Ashley
and like
Kidner.
cared."
Yeah, yeah, Ashley Kidner. Well, and it's really neat. So he made a work of art out of the coffin that was based on another story that I happen to do in the Hamden area, which is about a smokestack where chimney swifts were roosting as they
Cool.
migrated. And Ashley Kidner, the artist who took the coffin and made a artwork out of it, actually painted a picture of the chimney in it and the chimney swifts returning to roost. And after that story came out, they were able to preserve the chimney. So it was slated to be demolished for a new development, and they were able to keep it so that the migratory swifts can continue to roost there. So
Oh, that's so cool. And
yeah,
he's
that
so
was,
talented. So he's a
oh my
wonderful
gosh.
artist, but an amazing landscape designer.
Yeah.
And I adore his work. But we could
So
talk for
talented.
hours
Oh, I know,
about
I know.
the glory of
So
Wyman Park and Ashley but what I wanted to kind of draw out of that little snippet was like the ability for journalism to really make change in the world, and to, a story that maybe starts off as like, oh, this is a cute little cool phenomenon about chimney swifts. Now, they have a protected space to roost in on their migrations. So is that sort of part of what becomes a Julie story, that ability or that desire to make a change?
sure. And so also have done quite a number of stories that are much darker in theme. I did a series of stories about uh, some really bad behavior at the Maryland Park Service. The longtime park manager of Gunpowder Falls State Park was accused of rape of two employees. And I started digging into that story and wound up talking to dozens of former employees who talked about a toxic work culture, sexual harassment,
Mm.
bullying, and that led to a number of people being fired within the state park service and sort of sweeping changes there. I did a number of stories related to sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Um, and most recently, earlier this summer, along with two colleagues, Justin Fenton and Jessica Calafati, worked on a multi-part narrative series about allegations of sexual abuse at a evangelical mega church in Baltimore called Greater Grace.
Hmm.
Uh, So I do a lot of heavy work as well and sort of heavy reporting. To tell you a little bit about me, I was actually a psychology major in college. I thought really seriously about being a therapist, and I worked for our campus peer counseling center as a peer counselor and trained several classes of peer counselors after me as well. So I really spent a lot of time honing my listening skills and learning how to ask open questions and kind of not shut people down and encourage people to talk. And it wasn't until a few years after graduation that I actually decided to go back to school. I went to University of Maryland's Master's in Journalism program, and from there got the job at the Sun. But so I kind of had this whole time period where I thought that I would be a therapist, and I thought that was my calling. And I find that that comes in handy a lot when I'm working on stories that are emotionally challenging, as this story was about Gavin Knupp. So I actually was first introduced to Gavin's story through Facebook,
Mm.
um, which I find I feel like Facebook is sort of like the black sheep of social media sites because it's been around for so long. People kind of think like, oh, well, that's where my, uncle posts his political opinions I don't want to see. Or it's Facebook Marketplace where I've, found this pair of shoes. But there's so many Facebook groups that are devoted to current events or movements that I get quite a few story tips from Facebook.
Mhm.
Um, I belong because my beat is so broad. I've joined all these Facebook groups about, like what's happening in Catonsville, what's happening in Essex, just to sort of keep my eye on different things. And interestingly enough, I did a story about looking back at the Keepers, which was a Netflix documentary looking at sex abuse at Archbishop Keough High School in the 70s. And I talked to the women who were featured in that documentary and did a story kind of checking in with all of them in advance of the big report dropping on sexual abuse in the church. And in that process, some of the women that I talked to lived in Ocean City. And so Facebook started suggesting for me that I join this group called Justice for Gavin Knupp, which was focused on Ocean City. So I joined the group because I'm nosy and, was sort of curious what
Hallmark of a
it's
great
all about.
reporter, the nosiest neighbor around.
Exactly. Um, and I started seeing all of these posts. And I was really struck by, first of all, just how sad and how tragic this was.
Hmm.
I'm a mom myself, and you just kind of think of your kid, think of a 14-year-old being killed in a hit and run, and like, what could be more tragic than that? So it just was such an incredibly sad story. And then part of what made it so unique was that there was this real fierce online movement of people trying to see some sort of criminal justice action in this case. And it involved a lot of people who live in Ocean City or the surrounding towns year round. But also, there were just tens of thousands of people from all over the region who had joined the group, and they were putting stickers up, not just in the Ocean City area, but kind of all up and down the East Coast. They were traveling. They had these Justice for Gavin bracelets, and they were distributing those wherever they went. And it was sort of like a real movement. And I was intrigued by the fact that this case had galvanized so many people. Um, and and it was sort of like, what is going on here? Why had it been so long since they seemed to know who was driving this car,
Right.
how come so much time had elapsed before there was an arrest. And and I talked about it with my editors, our uh, our head of audience engagement had also spotted the Facebook group as well and was also intrigued by it. And we talked about how, although Ocean City is not necessarily the heart of our coverage area, for people in the Baltimore region, which of course is the heart of our coverage area, we're all familiar with Ocean City.
Mhm.
And many of us go there every year, or even if you don't go there every year, pretty much everyone in the Baltimore region has been to Ocean City at
Mhm.
least once and is familiar with it. And as I was watching the Facebook group, because it was probably weeks to months that I just sort of like kept an eye on the Facebook group before I really started reporting the story. I started to see that it was the off season, so it was quiet in Ocean City, but so many familiar businesses that I knew from going there had changed their signs to say "Justice for Gavin." And
Mm.
so I thought, this is something that's really gonna strike a chord with people who just visit Ocean City, because all these beloved businesses are showing their support for this cause as well.
Well, and,
Um,
and Ocean City is really, certainly in the off season, just a really tiny town,
it
and
is.
and people have lived there for a million years. And so when we talk about, how you kind of narrowed that focus, and I love that you start off structurally in the story with kind of making it seem like a whodunit. And then it becomes very clear, where those connections are. But how did you decide to focus? Because you could have, out of that, you could have written a lot of different stories. You could have talked about, the movement to seek justice, the effect on the small town, a profile of a great all-around kid. How did you decide to shape the story in the way that you did?
Yeah. Um, well, I feel like the heart um of a good story, or at least this to me, this type of story really needs to be about how the people who were most affected are feeling. And
Mhm.
so, I think the real heart of the story is kind of how his mother and sister and father and friends are dealing with their grief.
Mhm.
Um, so that was such a major element. I also really wanted to share Gavin's story and talk about who Gavin was, and what his passions and what his dreams were, and who he was at this sort of very poignant moment at 14, where he was shedding his kind of little kid self and really becoming a teenager. He was poised to start high school in the fall after he died. So, and then of course the movement I thought was really important to capture, and then what's going on with the criminal justice system. So, in talking to the state police and talking to prosecutors out there to get a sense of where the case was on a criminal level. So those
Mhm.
were all the key elements of the story, but I thought that the heart of the story was sort of how his family was dealing with this, and
Mhm.
how the family was dealing with their grief, and how it had motivated them to start a foundation, and to and just really this intense desire to see the driver brought to trial.
Right. And so when you're looking at, this feature story, can you, for people who may not be familiar with, how like the different types of stories that come out in their local news site, what makes it a feature in your mind, and how is that different from, a sort of traditional news story?
Sure. So, if this were excuse me, if this were breaking news, we would probably write a 14-year-old boy was killed in a hit and run accident, at the corner of Gray's Corner Road, and just sort of put out the straight facts there, and it would come out, almost immediately after it had happened. Um, if this were, and now we've sort of, it's kind of migrated to continuing coverage as we keep an eye on the legal wrangles. But there's other stories that would be more incrementally focused on a particular hearing or a particular chapter in the legal battle. But this was a feature story, so it was a step back story, and it allowed us to really do some storytelling to include the rich details about Gavin's life and his story, his family, what happened on that tragic night, to describe the memorial, to describe kind of how his friends and family had been dealing with their grief in the months following his death. So, I think in a feature story, there's more of an emphasis on the language, more of an emphasis on telling details. And of course, all of the accuracy is just as important. But there's also more room for emotion and more space to kind of talk about how people are feeling and to paint a picture of a community and a moment in time.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's so many more threads in a feature story, because it's not as transactional as a breaking news, it does have a lot more nuance. And so if you can talk a little bit about sort of the threads that you were pulling to create this feature, because, a lot of it, yes, you started with your Facebook group, but, I think it's not always clear, like, how do you, you're looking at a group, how do you then tease out the pieces? And do you just DM people and say, hey, I'm this random person you've never heard of? Or is there something deeper there? So like the mechanics of how you put that story together would be helpful.
Sure. So, so I sort of lurked around and studied this Facebook group for a while. I quickly figured out who his parents are, and saw that they're divorced. So I messaged each of them individually. And I'm trying to think back. I think actually his father messaged me back first, but wanted his mother to kind of be the family spokesperson, I think. So I think he sort of put me in touch with her. Then I had a sort of a long process of kind of encouraging her to talk to me because she was a little bit reticent at first. I think there was some discomfort from me being an out of town
Right.
journalist, because one thing I learned in this story is that the population of Ocean City, and they live right outside Ocean City in what's called Berlin or Ocean Pines. I think Ocean Pines is a neighborhood in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
The population of those two towns is just 12,000 during
Oh,
the
yeah, it's
off
minuscule.
season. But at this time of year, there's 300,000 people in Ocean City. So the people that live there year round are very close knit. And they kind of have their own distinct culture. It's a little different, I think, than the Baltimore culture. And they talk about everything on this side of the bridge is over the bridge. So there's like this sort of real Eastern Shore flavor there. So kind of took a while and a number of conversations before Tiffany was comfortable with us coming out there. I went out with a banner photographer named Caitlin Newman, who is a super talented photographer and also is very good at making people comfortable, which I feel like is, one of news photographers' gifts. And, for journalists have had opportunities to work with news photographers, like they really have this special ability, I think, of making sources feel comfortable. So it's often nice as a reporter when you're there and you're part of this reporting duo, that the photographer might sort of make connect with your sources as well. So Caitlin and I went out there and we met with Tiffany and we met with Summer, who's Gavin's big sister, and was also there the night that he was struck, and tried to revive him with CPR, and was really very deep in her grief herself. we were not able to meet with Ray, Gavin's dad, while we were out there, but I did speak with him over the phone. So yeah, so I did start by just DMing them on Facebook.
Mhm.
Another thing that I did before I went out there was I read all of the coverage that had already been done. And I think this is something that you're able to do as you're doing this sort of step back piece, is sometimes you're able to take a lot of reporting that has already been done by another news organization and kind of look at it and kind of see like, okay, well, here's, several months of daily continuing coverage of this, but we're going to kind of step back and tell this as a big picture story.
Mhm.
And you see that a lot in national publications, whether it's the New York Times or the Journal or the Post, where they might parachute into a community where there's been some sort of issue. And instead of getting bogged down in all of the weekly updates in the story, they're kind of able to tell this bird's eye view story of what happened. So yes.
And I also feel like with a feature story, it allows you, reading all that coverage allows you to see where the gap in coverage might be. You don't need to retread what Ocean City Today or the Dispatch has done or the Daily Times. Like you can say, oh, here's an angle that hasn't occurred yet, maybe because of distance or time, and that can help you focus.
Yes.
Um, I also wanted to go back to kind of the language that you can use, and your training as a psychology major and sort of that peer counseling aspect. So often reporters are put into, sort of like police officers, into the midst of someone's worst day, and trying to find out information or sort of trying to find out about the situation. What are some tactics that you use to kind of make that feel maybe less invasive or more comforting? Because you are parachuting, you're driving out and then you're driving back. You're not really part of that community. So what
Yeah.
do you do?
Well, I think that trauma-informed reporting is really important, and I recommend all journalists read about trauma-informed reporting or try to take a class or a seminar in that. Um, I think that it's really important to be trustworthy with your sources. If you say that you're gonna do or say something or be somewhere at a certain time, to follow through with that promise. I think it's important to be gentle and to allow them to go at their pace and to reassure them that that's okay. You can wait for them if they need some time to gather their thoughts, or if something's making them emotional, to offer them a tissue, to convey empathy. And that, I often, when I'm dealing with really sensitive topics, I tell people, like, if you tell me something, and then a few minutes later you're like, wait, I don't want to, I don't want that in the story. Like, that's okay. It's a different process than if you're grilling the mayor about his, whatever latest kerfuffle in City Hall. Like, everything that he's telling you,
Right.
it's on the record. You're there. Like, you're not really giving him that time. But this is a totally different reporting mode where you're really allowing people to feel comfortable talking to you. I interviewed a sexual assault survivor last week, and she's sort of not sure, like, how much she wants to put out there and how much she wants to come out in a story. And I said, that's fine. Like, we'll talk about it now, and then we'll revisit this in a week or two and kind of see what your comfort level is and where you want to go with this story. So in the same sort of mindset, I think is important when you're talking to people who are grieving, to kind of allow them that space. And I think both people who are grieving and survivors of sexual assault or sexual abuse, one thing that I've discovered is you kind of never know what response you're actually going to get from people at a specific time and day. And sometimes you might talk to people and they say it's immensely cathartic, and they were so glad that they talked to you and it was
Mhm.
really helpful. And it almost felt like a therapy session because they were able to sort of put something into words and step back and look at their own story. Other times, like, people might become really upset, people might become angry. So you kind of have to just hold space for whatever comes,
Mhm.
and be really calm and professional, regardless of what that response may be. One thing that we noticed a lot as we were reporting and talking to Tiffany and to Summer is that Gavin's mom would say, we talk about different things. Like, Caitlin was really interested in photographing Gavin's room because she
Mhm.
had mentioned that Gavin's room was pretty much preserved the way it was when he had passed away. And that we thought that would be very compelling photos, and I thought it would be compelling to see as a journalist. And so she would say, well, can't do that right now, but maybe this afternoon. And then, well, we can't, because we were there for about a day and a half. We can't do that right now, but maybe after dinner. Well, now
Mhm.
it's so late, but maybe in the morning. And in the end, we realized she just wasn't comfortable with that, but also wasn't comfortable just coming right out and saying no. But that's, we just kind of had to have that, leave that space for her. And rather than confront her on that and say, but wait, you said we could come. Just be like, okay, that's fine. I understand, that's absolutely fine. So to be really respectful as well of the boundaries that people set. If they say, I don't want to talk about this, or that's just too emotional for me to about right now, to let them have that space there as
Mhm.
well.
Well, last year we did a series about sort of jumping into communities and reporting in trauma-informed situations. Like Baltimore City is, you scratch the surface, there's trauma everywhere. There's trauma wherever we go. And so we had the Dart Center discuss, and they offer some really excellent training, and that's all on the MDDC YouTube channel archive for people if they're interested in it. So thank you for bringing that up. And what I'm getting from your experience and conversation is that survive in these situations, you want to make sure that your source has control and space and the ability to say no, because in whatever trauma that they've probably had, they didn't have those things.
Absolutely. Right.
And so I'm curious though, because because you dabbled in thinking about, well, maybe therapist is my line. Like, do you have any tips or ideas on where, your lane as a journalist is pretty straightforward, but sometimes the need is voracious and people sometimes want to talk, or do you ever feel like there's times where, you're sort of out of your depth, and then what do you do as this person who maybe has some intense grief or some intense trauma that you're like, this is not my journalist lane, but I see, like, this person is imprinting on me, or seeing me as a lifeline. Do you ever have those situations, and how do you deal with it?
You mean maybe if a source is kind of keeps talking to you and you're sort of moving on from that story? Um,
Right.
um, I wouldn't say I've had that particularly, and I think because so many of the stories that I do are sort of intense and personal, I stay in touch with sources for a very long time.
Mhm.
I was telling Rebecca this, but in July, I had a very severe bout of pneumonia and wound up in the hospital. And I was getting all these really nice notes from people I had written about 10 or 15 years ago. And I realized that, like, my sources kind of become a part of my world, and we maintain a relationship for a long time.
Mhm.
Um, but no, I've not had sort of like a boundary issue where I felt like someone was kind of a little too much. But many of the people I write about, I sort of feel like, um you know, it's the connection and the time we spend tapers off, but I still remain connected to them for months or years to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, and all the threads of what you do kind of build upon one another. Like source, we started off this conversation saying that a woman who you had interviewed about sexual abuse in the clergy story, she was kind of the source or pointed the way to this group, and so
Mhm.
it all does connect in. As we start to wind up, and I want our audience, if they have questions, to be able to ask them. I you had talked earlier about how when you're talking to sources and when you're talking to the family, like you said, okay, well, we can talk about this now and decide whether or not to put it in the story later. How
Mhm.
does that work? Because traditionally journalists don't, offer their source, like, I'll give you the story to read and you can edit or X out.
Oh,
So
we
what's
don't
that
do that.
interplay? Because
We certainly
that
don't
doesn't
do that.
happen.
Yeah. And it's not for like the entire, that's something very narrowly focused. But if someone says, here's this one thing, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with you putting this in the story. Then
Mhm.
with something very specific and narrow like that, then I'll say, well, let's put a pin in that and come back to it. Or the example that I was giving, which was about a sexual abuse survivor. She was sort of thinking, I don't know if I want to put my name out there. I'm not sure how comfortable I am publishing this. And there was another aspect of her story that she was also telling me that she was definitely comfortable with me publishing that. So that's why I was talking about putting a pin in like sort of one specific thing. But no, we absolutely do not show the stories to a source in advance. But often, again, when I'm talking about a very sensitive topic, I can tell sources that I can read their quotes back to them
Mm.
um, before we actually publish them. And sometimes people, when they hear their quote again, they do want to make a minor change or they think, well, that's not accurate or that so sometimes I will offer that to sources. And again, in a very sensitive story, I'll do pretty exhaustive fact checking with the sources as well. And that's kind of something that I really started to do when in those years I was freelancing, where I was doing a lot of magazine writing, because at the Sun I had kind of never done fact checking.
Mhm.
Um, and especially for a longer story like this, or something that's very sensitive, I'll kind of go back and I'll say, okay, so I'll scan the story as I'm talking to them on the phone. I'm like, okay, so we have X, then we have Y, then we have Z, and put all of that out there. And especially in talking with sexual assault survivors, one thing that a source taught me was that because she had been disbelieved for so long,
Mhm.
and because she felt like people were always trying to poke holes in her story, it was of utmost importance to her that every teeny fact was accurate.
Mhm.
So for example, I had written a story, um, and I mentioned that her abuser had picked her up from her front porch and it was published that way. And she became very angry about that and a couple other very tiny details like that. She was like, it wasn't a porch, it was a stoop. And I was like, thinking like, okay, isn't that like the same thing? But she was really adamant, and she was the one who said this to me, that like, I have dealt with people not trusting me, not believing me for decades. So it's imperative to me that every single thing be 100% accurate. So I will go back and fact check with sources in very sensitive stories as well.
Well, and I think when you're right, when you're disbelieved or someone like does a gotcha on the details, like, oh, you said it was a stoop last week and now it's a front porch. Well, were you lying then or are you lying now? That
Right.
is very destabilizing,
Yeah.
and very difficult. So, as a freelancer, I sort of feel like you come as the package deal because you're doing your own writing, you're editing, yes, you have an editor for your source publication, but and places like the Sun, fact checking is kind of in another department. It's not that the Sun didn't fact check. It's just you personally didn't have to do all of that. So how does that kind of, and throughout a career, you kind of pick up different skills and it shapes you and whatnot. What kind of, what does it mean to sort of fact check your own pieces, and how does that make you, or does it prompt any changes in the way you report a story?
Um, that's an interesting question. I don't know if it actually prompts changes in the way that I report the story. But I do always feel like at this stage in my career, when I'm turning a story into an editor, not like a quick daily story, but like a big meaty piece that I've spent several weeks or even months working on, um, I am 100% sure that like every word and every fact is correct. And I've already gone through and sort of edited it myself. I'll often read my stories out loud because I want to hear how they sound. I'll read them at different times of day and kind of work through edits at different times of day because I feel like my late night brain is a little different than my early morning brain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll sometimes even do it in different places. Like I'll read the story in the newsroom, or I often go off in these little side rooms or balconies to write. So I'll read it there, but I'll also read it at home. Um, and just trying to like kind of look at my story using different parts of my brain. Um, so I think like it has sort of changed me because instead of like turning in a story and feeling like, well, my editor will make that better, I
Right.
try to turn in a story and I'm like, this is absolutely the very best thing that I can do. And my editors will still make it better and
Sure.
still usually find, 500 words to cut out. Um, but I think I have more of a sense of like, let me get this perfect before I turn this in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that gives you more control over the story that you want to tell. If you're sending in something that you expect to be edited deeply, they may not edit it in the way that you want. So I think it's a wonderful sort of practice to get in to say, this is the work that I want to see out in the world.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm noting the time, and I do want to open up for questions. And Julie, if there's anything that you wanted to bring up that we haven't talked about, please do. But anyone listening along, do you have some questions for Julie? Oh,
Hi.
Natalie, come on in. So introduce yourself briefly, and I'll spotlight you for us.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm a reporting intern at the Daily Record. So I had like a few questions in mind. And I don't remember if you mentioned this earlier, but I guess the first question I had was like, how long did it take you to, like be a part of this whole project, like from when you first found the story to when the piece was actually published?
Um, so I started paying attention to this group, I think in December. Um, the story ran in early March. Um, one of the odd twists in the process, which I didn't mention, was that while I was in Ocean City, there was actually a gunman who fired at police very close to my house. And there was this whole manhunt. There was a man named David Linthicum. He's still awaiting trial, but he was having a mental health episode and his father called police. And then he fired at an officer, I think grazed him, and then ran off and hid in the woods. Very close to where I live.
Hi.
Um, and then was hiding. And right as I was driving back from Ocean City, I was listening to the Baltimore County Police scanner and kind of listening what was up. My kid's school had closed. My husband, who's the Banner's sports editor, was working from home and sort of monitoring the situation. And everyone was very much aflutter. And I got back, I picked up a rotisserie chicken for dinner, and I walked in and I put it on the kitchen counter. And and I'd been up since 7 o'clock in Ocean City. And just then we got word that police had closed in on the house because they thought he had returned to the house. And I was the closest reporter to it. And I still had my coat and my shoes on. So I like grabbed a piece of the chicken and just left and went up there. And it wound up that he was actually hiding in the woods. He shot another officer and really seriously injured him, and then took off and drove up to Harford County, and there was this big manhunt. So I wound up staying up until like 3 o'clock in the morning with this whole craziness happening here. And then we had like a couple, a week or so of like all these follow stories. How did this happen? What's going on? And so then I kind of like things quieted down. I actually wrote the story and it came out in early March. But I think the reporting happened in like early February, and it was early March before the story actually came out. So so we had like a little bit of time for it to percolate, but also had all this other crazy journalism happen.
But I think it's always interesting, you look at a story like this and you're like, oh, Julie's like working every day, all day on this story from X to Y. And really you're kind of weaving it in because, you're getting tips, there's breaking news, there's all this stuff. So your ability to compartmentalize and stay organized, serious props. I feel like it has to be top notch.
I write
Natalie, did you?
very long lists of things to do each week. It's like 70 things, and like cross off each task when I do it.
Absolutely. Natalie, did you have another question?
Yes. So I guess the other question I had was kind of like how you were able to deal with like the family when you were reporting. I know you said like you stayed there for like I think it was a day and a half or something like that. So like what did you kind of do in that time? Did you like sit down and like talk to them for hours, or like did you go out somewhere? Like how did you kind of navigate that? And like I guess like what type of questions did you ask? Like how did you really, get into such an emotional story?
So we met Tiffany and Summer for lunch. Then we went with them to the memorial site. And then I think we sort of all had a little break, and we reconvened for dinner. And excuse me, I'm still getting over my pneumonia. So it happened to be Tiffany's birthday. And so it was a dinner gathering with some of her friends who were also the mothers of her daughter's friends and her son's friends. And some of those kids were there as well. So that gave me an opportunity to interview some of Gavin's peers and some of his friends. And then we parted for the night, and we talked some about seeing each other in the morning. And then that didn't come together in the morning. And that was sort of, I think, the Tiffany feeling maybe emotionally exhausted or just kind of not up to that anymore. But it wound up, again, there was all this craziness happening back in the Cockeysville area. So I was kind of happy to monitor that. I think I was actually writing some of the stories about what was happening in my neighborhood while in Ocean City, and then hit the road. So
Great.
yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? I'll take you off the spotlight there. Tiara, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My question is, how do you advocate for yourself to your editor when you're trying to give your sources leniency and to give them that understanding, especially when they're pushing for a story to be done?
That's a good question. I don't think that those things like necessarily cancel each other out. I can explain to an editor, look, I know this, my source told me this, but they're not comfortable with it being in the story, but I'm working on them, and maybe they'll get to a place where they're comfortable with that. But I'm at the same time I'm writing and I'm creating this story for them to look at. So I don't think that necessarily has to slow the story down too much. But yeah, but that's a good question.
Any other questions, Tiara?
No, that's it.
Okay. And one of the things that actually, Tiara, you had a great question the last time we did master class about, and I'd like to close with this, but what is the best advice you've been given about being a journalist and navigating in this world? I know it's a toughie, isn't it?
I will say this is maybe my own my own advice, but I just think details, like really specific details, are so important. And when I kind of look back at this story, like like just the fact that I mentioned that Gavin's green cap lay in the road, like to know the color of it is important. Or when I'm describing like the details of what Gavin liked to do when he was growing up, and where they would fish and what fish they would catch, and exactly kind of like what types of, like, I wouldn't just say he liked hunting and fishing, but to put the details of like how and when he did it with his dad. The ending of the story, I talk about, we've kind of gone into this whole legal drama, and we've talked about the movement, and we've talked about the Facebook group. But then I kind of end with those really specific details again. We end with his mom talking about going to the grocery store and seeing double stuffed Oreos and how she'll reach for them. And then she remembers her child who loved them is gone. And I think that there's always so much power in those really specific details, and you don't want to lay them on too thick. But if you just sort of sprinkle the specific details throughout your story, I think it makes it much more poignant and much more immediate. And I think a lot of times what we're doing when we're writing a feature story is kind of making a collage with the facts. So you do all your reporting, and you lay out all your facts on the table, and you might have 200 of them, but you only have space to include 40 of them. So you have to pick the 40 facts that tell a complete and accurate and moving story. So it's a bit like being a collage artist, where you can't include all of it, but you've got to include the important ones that will tell you all that you need to know in terms of all the facts, but also all of the emotional content that you wish to convey as well.
I think that's so powerful, because that's what, you're really making that story or that situation come alive and painting that picture for people. And I love the metaphor of the collage, because you are, as a reporter, I think, always writing down those details, keeping track of all those bits and pieces and the facts, but you have to winnow it down and really think, where do I get the most, what are the most effective things to tell the story that I want to tell? So I think that's, thank you for that advice. That's great advice. And thank you also for joining us today. This was terrific. And I feel like it was a great closeout to our masterclass session. So thank you for doing that, Julie.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, @mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.